6 warehouses from different cities, and we have over 3,500 vehicles on the road 24 hours, and we are distributing the goods to different places and to the world. And when they ask us, who are you, then we are saying we are Netlog very proudly. Anywhere there is life, there is logistics, and anywhere there is logistics, there is Netlog.
Sıradaki panelimizin
The sponsor of the next panel is TAP, and the title of the next session is The Future of Global Economy and Developing Countries. What is the root of global economy? How developing countries will react? Assumptions of the central banks will be the topic of this session. The moderation of the session will be carried out by the General Manager of McKinsey Turkey, Özgür Tanrıkulu. I would like to invite him to the platform, please. And we will continue with our panelists. From India, the former governor of RBI, Mr. Duvvuri Subbarao, to the platform, please. The former president of the Central Bank of Chile, José de Gregorio. General Manager of TEP, Ümit Leblebici. Have a nice session.
Evet efendim, merhabalar, ben
Hello to everyone, my name is Özgür Tanrıkulu. I would like to thank you for participating in our panel. As you can see, this is a very global session. We have many speakers from India to Chile, and of course we have a speaker from Turkey. So when we are speaking about the changing world, we have representatives who are actually representing this changing world, and hopefully they will enlighten us with their speeches. We will speak about the world economy, we will speak about the central banks, and we will also speak the possible impacts of the economies and politics and how it will shape the future. And I had a chance to speak with our panelists before the session, and I realized that they have enlightening perspectives, and hopefully this session will be quite interesting for each and all of us. Before continuing with the questions to our panelists, the world economy is actually going through a very interesting times, because we see such a strong economic performance. This year, for example, world economy will be growing by 3.7%, and for the upcoming 2 years, the expectations are 3.9%. And more interesting than that, it is not the case for one region, it is actually the case for North America, for Europe, and we see such growth in those places as well, because in the past, the petroleum products and the raw materials were actually contributing to the growth, but right now the growth is coming from different sectors. So we have such a strong global economic performance. But we also have to think about the long term when we are speaking about the economic growth, because we have certain concerns whether this economic growth will be sustainable or not. Some of those concerns are for the short term. As you know, interest rates are at quite low levels, and this is actually the result of the central bank's policies, and the inflation rates are quite low on the global sense. But with the expectations for an increase in the inflation rates, maybe the interest rates will be increasing as well. well, and maybe this will have an impact on the growth rate because of the short-term contractionary monetary policies. There are certain concerns for the economic growth and economic performance. But I do believe the concerns for the long term are even higher. Maybe we can actually evaluate those from different perspectives. This unjust income distribution is actually a huge problem on the global sense, and it has economic and political consequences, and we are concerned about those for the future, because it actually shows itself in different places. In addition to that, the technological advancements are also bringing the efficiency, and digital transformation is actually the topic of many sessions. And this digital transformation is also bringing about the fears of unemployment. As actually one of those researchers are showing us that the robots can actually take the jobs of 800,000 people. And this was actually the article which was published most of the time in Turkey. So for short term and for long term, there are huge concerns. Of course, the economic performance is good, but at the same time, there are lots of concerns for the short term and long term, and we will listen to those topics from our speakers. First of all, I would like to start with Dr. Subbarao from India. As you know, he is the former governor of RBI. I will ask my question in English.
Dr. Suba, we talked a little bit also outside about the implications of the current world economy and the growth rates. Obviously, India and the broader emerging markets have been on a good growth curve. India has been on a strong, impressive growth curve. I read that India is likely to overtake UK and France this year as the world's fifth largest economy. At the same time, given the challenges and that we are facing going forward in terms of the rate structures and so on, and if you think as a central banker, how do you see from a developing market perspective the agendas of central banks, and particularly for India, what do you see the fundamental priorities to keep that growth curve also on the monetary side?
Thank you very much. Thank you for putting the global economy in context and asking a question about central banking and about India. Central banking has changed quite a lot in the last 10 years. Remember the global financial crisis? Central banks were blamed for getting the world into the crisis. Central banks were praised for getting the world out of the crisis. So over the last 10 years, central banks around the world, in rich countries, in emerging economies like India and Turkey, and in poor countries, are trying to cope with this globalization, as it were. There are many challenges for central banks in rich countries, normalization of interest rates, reducing the balance sheets, etc. There are challenges for central banks of emerging economies like India, Turkey, Mexico, Chile, South Africa, and the challenges for central banks of poor countries like Africa. I'll focus on one big challenge for central banks of emerging economies, on which I think India and Turkey have quite a lot in common. One of the big challenges central banks of emerging economies are having to contend with over the last 10, 15, 20 years is this financial globalization. Capital moving in and out of national borders, which is a good thing in some sense, because emerging economies like Turkey, India, we need foreign capital, but we need stable capital. But the reality is that capital is very volatile, comes in surges, suddenly stops and then goes back. That creates a lot of problems for emerging economies. It forces our exchange rate out of line with our fundamentals. It pushes up asset prices, creates inflation, impairs financial stability. So the big challenge for central banks is to contend with this financial globalization, in particular the movement of capital in and out. Remember 2013, the taper tantrums? They were the fragile 5 countries. India was one of them. Turkey was one of them. There was South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia. We were the fragile 5 because our exchange rates plummeted as soon as the US Fed chairman, then Chairman Bernanke, said that they were going to taper quantitative easing. That's just one symptom or evidence of this risk of financial globalization. Take my country, India, for example. We had an enormous amount of capital inflows before the global financial crisis. Our exchange rate appreciated. The Reserve Bank was called upon to defend the exchange rate against depreciation. Then we had the crisis. Capital fled, left our country, the exchange rate plummeted. The Reserve Bank was called upon to defend the exchange rate against depreciation. Then there was quantitative easing, a lot of money in the global system. All that money was expected to be spent or used in rich countries. It was not used there. So it fled to emerging economies in search for yield. Again pushed up our exchange rates. Then there were taper tantrums. So over the last 10 years, we've had several bouts of different, sometimes appreciation pressure, sometimes depreciation pressure. What do? One thing we've been told all along is that central banks must let their exchange rates float. Let the exchange rate float freely, find its own level, and that will take care of all the problems. We did that and paid a very heavy price. During the quantitative easing, when a lot of capital was coming in, I was the governor at that time, we did not intervene in the market with the result that the exchange rate appreciated. And when taper tantrums came, suddenly there was overcorrection, there was volatility in the exchange rate. We paid an enormous price. So letting exchange rate float freely is not an option for emerging economies. The second thing we've been told is capital controls. Put a tax or control how much capital is coming in or how much capital is going out. It's very easy to say in theory, but very difficult in practice. Capital controls are very messy. If you say that capital cannot be taken out, people under invoice exports. Capital goes out anyway. So capital controls are not good. What's the other thing you can do? You've got to intervene in the foreign exchange market. That's what most emerging economies do. But to do that, you need a lot of reserves. And maintaining a reserve buffer is costly. So there are no simple options. There are no benign options. All options are expensive. One option, which is ideal, is global cooperation. If emerging economies, advanced economies, and poor economies, we could all get together and coordinate our policies. Remember currency wars? During the G20 meetings, between, let's say, 2008 to 2013, when I was governor, and perhaps even now, one of the constant issues, one of the main issues that comes up all the time is currency wars. Emerging economies telling America, telling Europe, telling other rich countries that they must be sensitive to the spillover impact of their policies. But advanced economies are quite dismissive of that request. They say that we make our policies for our country. Like the US Federal Reserve Chairman says, I make the Federal Reserve policy to suit the American economy. I can't take into account Turkish economy, Indian economy, Mexican economy. My responsibility is to the American economy. So we tell them they must be sensitive to our needs, to the spillover impact. They say that they cannot be sensitive, that we must manage ourselves. So the sum and substance of this one big challenge for central banks in emerging economies is to manage these forces of globalization, financial globalization. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's quite interesting, I think, as you say, how central banks, in a way, would have to look at their both national interests, but have to play in a coordinated fashion given the global implications. So, and that takes us to Professor Gregorio and to South America. And I have really two questions on my mind. The first one is broadly in this global context and in a way post-commodity price world, how do you see the South American both economy in general and the obviously the actions therefore taken by the central banks? But I'm also very curious to hear a little bit about the Chilean story as well, because it is quite an impressive growth story, and one that has clearly differentiated itself among its peers, and especially in the region. And it will also be good, and I know it's probably take hours, but just in a few minutes, what are the highlights of that, so that we also get to share with the audience as well.
Okay. Thank you very much for the question, and thanks very much for the invitation. It's far away from Chile, but it's worth to come. Let me just briefly, because then I want to touch on some of the issues that Mr. Subbarao mentioned. Let me just briefly on Latin America. I think that Latin America is a commodity-intensive region. It was very benefited by the commodity price boom. The economies grew like never before, so average rate of growth in the region, Brazil, and they growing at rates about 5% for many years, was extremely successful. But was with the tailwinds from commodities. Then it came the crisis, then it came the commodity slowdown. One thing about commodities, I don't think that this is the end of commodities, so to exaggerate that we're going all the other way around. There are differences, I think, that in energy, oil, and metals, and food. I think that there is a huge uncertainty about the future of oil and energy because of what's going on with technology around the world. Metals, they will always be needed, and we always need food, so I don't have a major concern, which is good for most Latin American countries. Yeah. Now, how they will, I think that we face a very serious macro problems, as Mr. Subbarao said, with the first this started after the crisis with the announcement of taper tantrum, large depreciations all across the region after having these so-called currency wars. But overall, central banks have been able to accommodate this first by intervening very little on the foreign exchange market. They have let their exchange rate to depreciate, and contrary to what was our history, the pass-through from exchange rate to inflation was quite limited. And this is interesting because there are two things to be worried about. We always say that we should let exchange rate to flow, but there are two big challenges or two big fears. One is inflation, that the exchange rate depreciates 20%, 30%, and then inflation keeps going. The other challenge is financial instability, that firms and banks, they are mismatched in terms of their currency asset and liabilities, so they suffer financially a lot. And we have a lot of stories. What's happened now after taper tantrum, in Chile, in Brazil and Argentina, currencies depreciated. In Brazil, they went from 2 reais per dollar to 4 reais per dollar. So that's crazy for a normal country. But they had an increase in inflation. Inflation came down quite gradually after this process stopped. And there was no, I would say there was no a strong persistence of the inflationary phenomenon. So we can accommodate large fluctuations. In the case of Brazil, they intervened. It was a massive, massive depreciation. But overall, I think that one of the key issues that was at the core of Latin American crisis in previous years, that were the exchange rate rigidities, now is over. And exchange rate rigidities, basically what they produced was a lot of speculation against central bank and a lot of open positions and a lot of exposure to exchange rate fluctuation. That's not longer the case. So I think that we have been able to accommodate, but in an environment of low growth. Growth in Latin America now today, on average, is about 3%. But this is not a problem with macro policy, the global environment. It's a problem, and I think that most emerging markets, not just in Latin America, but all around the world is happening, is that we have very low productivity growth. That productivity growth that has been declining in advanced economies is also declining in emerging markets. Moreover, it has been low for many, many years. So this will take me to the case of Chile that you are asking. Chile is an economy that well, we're proud it has been extremely successful. After having crisis, and it was able to grow at record and have a very, very big rate of growth from the late 1980s to the late 1990s. And then it has been able to keep a moderate pace, I would say, average about 4%, roughly. But before was like 6-7%. So this created that the Chilean economy went from being, in 1990, per capita GDP was 24% of that of the US, PPP measure. This is a technical detail, and now it's 42. So there has been a lot of catch-up. Now you may ask why, and I think that there are a couple of things. First, the macro. It's not to overemphasize macro, but on the macro front, it's very strong fiscal policy. Very strong. Chile has net debt of 10%, and it has had even negative debt in the commodity boom because we save a lot. But it has a very strong fiscal policy that allows to have low inflation and a central bank that can be able to run low inflation without being subordinated to fiscal needs. So I think that with an independent, very strong independent central bank. A strong financial system. We had a crisis in the 80s. So most of the accommodation that Mr. Subbarao mentioned about all the problems that have capital coming in and out and trying to control the flows, most of what's going on today in Chile is a strong financial supervision. So instead of trying to discriminate, which sometimes countries may try to do it, according to whether money is coming from abroad or whether these are internal flows and movements, we care a lot about the balance sheet of the financial system. And I think that's quite important and has been the story. And finally, just to mention about, I think that which is quite important in Chile, and it has been going on in the rest of the region in recent years, although in Chile started much early. Chile is a small, open market economy with strong social policies. I think that you want to talk more about that, which is a big issue, but with a lot of export orientation, very decentralized, respectful of property rights, which has created an environment for investment and growth.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Ümit Bey, şimdi siz
Mr.
masanın
Ümit,
öbür tarafında oturuyorsunuz.
you are
Herkes
actually sitting on the other side of the table, and you also have experience at the Treasury. So you actually have a good know-how about the Treasury. That's why I also would like to ask you a question. What kind of actions the central banks should take? Because we also know that the interest rates will be increasing on the euro level and the dollar level in the future. That is what we are expecting. So what do you think the actions the central bank should do in the emerging markets and the developed markets?
Thank you very much. Being on the other side of the table and being next to such two distinguished speakers, being beside them is something very important. I believe that the central banks do have some certain duties which they need to carry on, but we, as a Turkish people, do love mathematics. Cahit Bey, for example, is a very important mathematician. We really do respect it, and would like to explain it with some mathematics. I will be giving you some examples why this business is difficult. Then look at the number of the participants in Uludağ Summit, beyond 1,200. And from Uludağ to Bursa, we need to go down. And let's place an autobus, and it will be taking off at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And 1,200 people will be going down with a regulation and considered as a central bank. The business is very easy. We will call people to get ready at 2 o'clock. The bus will be taking you, and you will be going down the hill. First of all, the women and the children and men will be coming. Everybody came on time. The business is very simple. Let's make the business a little bit complex. We made a normal distribution. Maybe we will be having queues, maybe we will be having some problems, maybe some of them will be going on time, but there is no major problem. I have divided into two groups. One of the buses will be leaving in the morning, and one of them will be leaving at night. at 8 o'clock, and I have started to announce it. In the previous years, they were taking off at 2 o'clock. Now we do have an 8 o'clock bus in the morning and 8 o'clock bus at night. The authority needs to approach it as follows. Who will be going 8 o'clock in the morning and who will be going 8 o'clock at night? And between 8 and 8, between morning 8 and night 8, what will be organized for the ones who are remaining back behind? So we need to organize this. There are 3 behavioral codes that we observe. The first the behavioral code will be the ones who do not know it most probably will get ready and will start the queue in front of the hotel at 2 o'clock. And the ones who have heard this announcement will be thought that, oh, I'm going to go in the morning, and the rest of the people who do not know will be going at night. And one of them will be behaving that if I stay in the morning at 8 o'clock in front of the hotel, I may catch the 8 o'clock bus in the morning, and they will start to calculate. We don't have a single alternative. We do have diversity in alternatives. So we need to look into the details. When we go to the real life, the Abe is sitting in front of me. I will be asking you a question. If you say that in 100 countries, 1 million rooms will be created. If you get in such kind of a construction business, how long will you take to construct that? Consider the regulations and permissions. It won't be enough for a single life. There are 2 companies who are doing this in the world. One of them has done it in 100 years, Hilton. In 100 years, all around the world, they have opened hotels and they have opened rooms. They do have about 900,000 rooms. And the other company is 1 year, has done it in 1 year. So you're a central bank, and you are sitting down in the old fashion, in the old tradition. You see what's going on. Hilton is coming and taking permissions and being in need of funds, and another company is coming and totally changing the whole demand. And how are you going to achieve it? It's very hard to cope with this situation. It is very hard. Coping is very difficult. When we go 2 days ago, we were discussing about the monetary policies all around the world. The United States declared that I'm going to add 20% of taxation for the goods coming from China. Your central bank policies totally turn upside down. We're only speaking Industry 4.0. Okay, we do have it. We do have Life 4.0, and we do have the Finance 4.0. In Finance 4.0, what I observe on the central bank side, the most difficult thing is the predictability, because we don't have that high level of predictability, and there's a high level of volatility. And when we go back to the Indian central bank and Chile central bank, exactly, there needs to be an international coordination. Otherwise, a central bank's decision is having an impact on the global economy. Okay, we will be speaking about Turkey, but when we go back to Turkey, when we look at our picture, when I look at the turnover of my own bank, it is reflecting the other Turkish banks' turnover. 40–45% of Forex can be counted, can be money on deposit, can be mentioned. And when we look at the central bank and Turkish lira's monetary policy, they do have a policy, but they are not able to apply any Forex monetary policy. So the impact zone will be only limited with my turnover. 60%, 65%. What will happen on the Forex side? We are never discussing that side. As I have told you, our central bank governor has just mentioned that whether we will be having the Forex, what type of a Forex we will be, floating rate of exchange we will be preferring, and what are we going to pay. And later on, we have applied the right policies. We have started to decline the inflation by balancing our turnovers, but 40% of an amount, a Forex reality which we cannot manage. And when we look at actually central banks do have a limited coordination. There needs to be a full coordination, and of course this is the impact on the banks. We will be speaking about Turkey more, and I'm cutting my speech right now. Professor Gregory.
Yes, I hope the translation was okay, so I will interpret you properly. But I want to to be cautious and to put a little bit of, I'm not sure about the issue of policy coordination. Optimally, we would think that we should coordinate because there are a lot of spillovers across countries. But then when we go to democracies, I think that would be, this is if we can do it, to have just one monetary policy. It's tricky because you have different regions, it's like Europe. But then you have the problem, let's think the US will say, we won't cut rates because that will affect the competitiveness of India. So most likely, the candidate to the presidency that will say, let's put America first again, will win landslide. Because the mandate of governments is to take care of their people, and then their neighbors. So it's very difficult to think that the US, for example, if it needs a very expansionary monetary policy, they will say we will not be as expansionary to reduce our unemployment rate because this may affect China, whatever. And then it comes against, and I'm very also critical of all the issue because as we from emerging markets say, the US or advanced economy don't take care about us when making policies, then it comes the discussion from the other side. They say, well, but China is manipulating their currencies. I think that first we should have some form of general rules in the world economy, very general rules. But then countries should do what they think best for their economies. And I think that that's what brings the benefits. The rest of the countries, small open economies, will have to learn to navigate. For that we need strong institutions and policies. We'll suffer a little bit from time to time, but we will have to navigate and so our first goal is to take care about the strength of our domestic policies, because it's utopical to think that the US will take care or will worry too much about what's going on in Chile with their monetary policy. Yeah. It's a more practical.
Make it correct, I will say in English, I didn't say anything that you have US cooperate everything. Of course you are right. Each country, they have to pay attention to their priorities. So, and they have to build up a monetary policy for their subs. That's true. But do we need global coordination? I think that's also need. And this is also true.
It would be like, it's very difficult in macro, but a good coordination device that now is under threat is WTO.
Yes, so you can do it on the trade side.
In macro, that we could try. It's difficult because countries choose different policies, but it's not like openness. It's difficult, but it's and for that is the IMF and all these discussions.
Yeah. And we will talk a bit about that because I think that touches a broader issue around, I think, again, the whole point of income inequality, both across the world but within countries. I think they're all interlinked at the end fundamentally. Dr. Stewart, you want to add something? So let me just...
I don't want to add about this issue of coordination among central banks for their policies has come up. I agree with what José said, that given that the world is divided into nation states, the different countries, each country's central bank makes policies for what is best for that country. They cannot possibly be taking into account the situation of every other country in the world. We are not asking for that. What we're asking for is something much less than that, which is that when advanced economies, especially those countries whose policies have enormous spillover impact, like the United States, like Europe, like China to some extent, they must be sensitive to the spillover impact of their policies. I'm not saying that they must settle for second-best solutions, but even as they settle for what is best for their economy, they must be sensitive to what's happening, what's going to be the implication of this, and is there any way I can tailor my policy without compromising what is best for my own economy, but at the same time taking care of the spillover impact.
Yeah. Which I think nicely connects to the next question that I wanted to pose to all of very briefly, and I think that's where sort of debate is going as well, and that is the whole point around income inequality. And I know this is a bit of an unfair question because this goes way beyond the typical central banker's mandate worldview. Yet here we are, and it's a bit difficult to discuss monetary policy without thinking through broader implications. Because in the world that we are heading to, and I think that was a debate that's going on, I very much understand the national interests of what U.S. wants to think, and Germany versus India and so on. At the same time, the reality is, the world, whether we like it or not, is getting way more connected. And when Africa is going to triple its population, and reality is the rest of the world, it will be very hard for us to sort of ignore and just take a national interest. I'm just curious as to, and again, slightly, I know, going beyond your maybe areas of focus for so far, but in a world where that feels a bit more polarized, right? Again, talking of trade wars back and forth, right, and the effectiveness of WTO, whether questions, and so a lot of things that are being raised, especially on the political arena. And if you take the income inequality and risks for the future, are you worried? Do you think this is, this is just a natural phase that we're going to go through? Do you see that anything that the policymakers can do in terms of both taking local and global at the same time?
Oh, certainly, most certainly. Income inequality is a big, big issue in rich countries, in emerging economies, in poor countries. In his excellent presentation, the Deputy Prime Minister yesterday talked about the medium to short-term prospects of global economy, which is very good, but about the risks in the long term. And one of the important things he mentioned, in fact, very important thing, is income inequality. Income inequality is something that is dividing America, dividing Europe, dividing poor countries like India. But income inequality in poor countries like India is a different problem altogether than in rich countries. Because in rich countries, people who are losing or earning less than, they are unequal.
Yeah.
Okay? They're not starving. They're not at subsistence level. It's just that their incomes are not going up as rapidly as incomes of the very rich. The bottom 1% see that their incomes are growing much more slowly than the top 1%. But their incomes are growing all the same. And they have enough to eat. They have a house to live in. They probably have a car to drive. But in a country like India, and I want you to know that India, 1.2 billion population, roughly perhaps a little more than Africa, we have more poor people in India than the entire continent of Africa. So India is a growing economy, a large economy, second biggest in whatever, the fastest growing large economy in the world and all that, but we are also a very poor economy. And India also, even as we're growing rapidly, are facing a problem of income inequality. Poor people are seeing their standards of living improving, but improving at a much lower rate. So poverty levels are still quite large. And the government has to do a lot of things. The structural reforms. This is not the forum to talk about all the things that a country like India has to do. But if you would ask me for a one-word answer, what is it that India needs to do in order to manage this growing income inequality, I would say create jobs. India, just to give you one statistic, there is 1 million people joining the labor force every month. That's 12 million per year. We are not even creating a quarter of as many jobs. So the demand for jobs is going up. The supply of jobs is very limited. The divergence is growing, and that's creating income inequality. And that's a thing that policymakers, including central bankers, have to be very sensitive to.
Thank you. That's very interesting numbers. Professor Gregorio, what's your views?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Although I'm central banker, do most macro, I have spent part of my academic time looking at income inequality, growth and development. And let me just tell you why I think that the income inequality has become such an issue, so important everywhere you go. So I came here to Turkey after discussing income inequality in Chile to talk about central banking, and you tell me income inequality. So you said everywhere. And the reason, there are two reasons. One is related to the broad trends around the world. So the fact is roughly the following. most equal countries have become more unequal in the last 20, 30 years. So let's say advanced economies that used to be more equal around the world, they have increased inequality. The same for Asian countries. Asian countries is another group of countries that is relatively equal when you compare, and they have become more unequal, so it becomes an issue. Eastern Europe also big changes. They are still comparatively, relatively more equal than Africa and Latin America, that are the examples of inequality. However, inequality has increased. Now, what's happened in the other extreme, and let's talk about Latin America. Latin America, inequality has declined. Growth has gone up, but inequality is still very high. So inequality is still an issue. So it doesn't matter that inequality has come down, but still we're much more unequal than the other countries that I mentioned you at the beginning in terms of inequality, than advanced economies, Europe, or so inequality has become a problem in equal countries because inequality has increased, and in unequal countries, despite they are less unequal, because they are still very unequal. So it's a very. Second, this is also the tension of richness, because we can be proportionally more unequal in a poor society, but it's not very evident, like when in a rich country the same inequality results in a higher total inequality. Let's say that if the top 10% is 10 times the top 20%, the top 10% in a very poor economy is very different, that difference. Although inequality is still the same, it's much more evident, and we live in a society with much more information. So inequality is a big issue. What's the problem of that is that may create distortions in policy making. Chile is a very interesting case. This is interesting because Chile, in the last 10 years, there was and this is after the crisis. After the crisis, I forgot, after the crisis, what's happened is that many poor people pay the cost of the crisis with high unemployment, and we saw in the US, the ones that caused the crisis going out and living with huge severance payments. So there is a sense of also an equal adjustment. What's happened in Chile is that like 8 years ago, started a big discussion about inequality. So the country picked a president that was center-left, and the country moved to the left to more equal policies. And that's fine, I support many of them. But they didn't take care too much about growth. So the economy didn't grow that much. They tried to implement a lot of pro-equality reforms, some of them quite poorly done, that damaged confidence, growth came down, and now came a government, center-right, that said, well, that's fine, but we have to grow again. What is interesting is that the current government said, we have to grow again without forgetting about the need of social inclusion. So I think that this is a big issue. And looking very far in the future, I don't want to talk too much about this because it's a very interesting issue. We come in a world, and McKinsey has also some projections in which all 40% in 2050, 40% of the current jobs will be done by robots. So we're facing a huge challenge. And and we shouldn't say we don't want progress because it's dangerous for jobs. There will be jobs, but there will be new jobs, different things. We don't know, and we have to be prepared. So perhaps there will be one robot per person, and we even won't need to work, okay, in very distant future. However, the question is whether that robot will belong to us or will belong to Jeff Bezos.
Yes.
And it's a huge difference. There is a distributive difference. There will be different prices to allocate resources. There will be a huge tension on redistribution from the fiscal policy and tax system. So I think that we have to be prepared. We shouldn't try to avoid it because we cannot avoid it, and it is bad to avoid it. But we have to have enough flexibility to think for this new world that I think that's fascinating, but quite challenging. We cannot make this. I like this story because we cannot make the mistake or have the approach. There is a very old story about Milton Friedman, for many, all what about free market. But he went to China, and they showed him a huge construction site, and people told him, look at this construction site. We're really building a huge country. And he saw that there was a lot of people with shovels doing the construction. And he said, well, do you know that you can do that with machines? And you can do it much efficiently with machines and not that many people. And all the which I would say, we care about progress, but we care also about jobs. And his answer was, well, so replace the shovels by spoons. We'll have much more people working. So that's not the idea, I think. The idea is how we embrace progress and take advantage and face the challenge to make all people better off.
Thank you, Professor. I think it is about, as you said, it's not income inequality is not about the income itself, because reality is with productivity there will be a lot more income to come, reality with robots and everything else. It's more about the distribution of that wealth and how that is distributed across. Şimdi Ümit Bey size de gelir şeyi soracaktım ama bence artık...
Ümit Bey, I will be asking you something else, but let's shift the topic. Let's speak about Turkey. About the monetary policies, let's speak about. Murat Bey is not here. We are all alone here. Osman Bey may put on his earphones. I would like to learn with you about the monetary policies. What are you expecting to see?
Şimdi Merkez Banka
Well, as I said, central banks have lots of difficulties, and the monetary policy should be shaped according to such difficulties. Well, up until now, I think Turkey actually performed quite well. Starting from 2001 crisis, we actually took the necessary precautions and we advanced a lot. And I also can say that the income distribution is quite good. And the involvement of the women to the labor force was an important step, and it was really important for the social inclusion. From there on, I will say a couple of words about the monetary policies of the central bank. There is something we are relatively less successful. And what is it? Well, the countries who are in need of capital has similar problems. The foreign capital comes and sometimes it actually goes away. And when the capital is flowing away from the country, this creates a huge pressure on the foreign exchange. And we have this indexation problem of foreign exchange. And since we couldn't solve this problem, all of the pricing is actually done through the foreign exchange, and this creates an inflation. And we couldn't solve this problem. And since we couldn't solve this problem, some of our monetary policies are ineffective, because we can only control the 60% of the issue. The 30% we cannot control because of the pricing based on the foreign exchange. I mean, I believe the central banks should create this stabilization, and they should reduce this volatility for the foreign exchange. We might need such a monetary policy in Turkey. And this might require interest rates to be increased from time to time and to be decreased from time to time. But unfortunately, the central banks are only actually focusing on the overnight interest, because, I mean, many of our credits are for the long term. We don't have many short-term loans, but short-term credits. And if you take a look to this yield, line, the yield curve, the productivity curve, then you can actually be successful with the growth. I believe the predictability data of the central banks are not as strong as they were in the past, because the economy is changing. There are lots of input and output. Well, for central banks, I mean, they have many data that they have to manage. And at the same time, on the trade side, there is a need for coordination with the WTO, World Trade Organization, because the global protectionist policies are actually hampering the international trade. I believe we also have to do structural reforms in order to reduce current account deficit. If we can reduce our current account deficit, then we will have a broader room for maneuver. And then the pressure on the foreign exchange will be reduced. For example, India has its example. With regards to their foreign exchange, they actually took their precautions. And the precautions that we can take with the central bank and on the economic side, I believe will be materialized in the future. Food prices leads to inflation in Turkey, and we established a food council, and we are trying to increase our productivity with regards to food sector. And we actually put limitation for the SMEs to borrow with the foreign exchange in order to reduce the fluctuations, and we will see its results in the future. I cannot speak on behalf of the central banks because my data set is different. But the Central Bank of Turkey, by making use of its instruments, can do anything it's like. And up until now, it actually showed that it is quite capable. From time to time, we are criticizing the central bank. For example, in December, we actually waited an increase in the points by 2 or 3 points, and then the foreign exchange was stabilized. We have to have a trust in our central banks, and we have to facilitate their job, and we are in need of a comprehensive approach for the economic policies. Thank you very much.
The discussion, I thought it was a very interesting one.
And thank you very much for our participants for listening.
Thank you very much for your contribution and for your valuable information. We appreciate it. Çok teşekkür ediyoruz.
Thank you so much to our panelists. Distinguished participants, right now we will watch the video of Netlog Logistics. Each day from hundreds of villages we are collecting the milk from the accredited villages, and in 30,000 points our milk products are going to our customers. In order to protect the nutritional values of our products, we have to transfer them with the appropriate and the suitable